Hi, this is Paul. I know I made a bunch of CRC videos last week. That's because that was on my mind. But one of the videos I listened to a little while ago now, really right after it came out, because I always catch these videos because I really love these universal history videos, is Richard Rowland and Jonathan Peugeot on Purgatory. Purgatory has been a fascinating topic for me for a long time. Now, I know as Protestants, I understand and agree with sort of the Protestant rationale for not teaching purgatory in the church. But the questions that I had behind purgatory, and I think a lot of these were sort of seeded by Lewis and the Great Divorce, and some of the stuff that Lewis would write about that, because of course Lewis treats with all of this ancient stuff. Um, and so their treatment of purgatory, this was really interesting. And now there's sort of the newest thing that's coming out are all of these videos and lessons and classes that are behind paywalls and that are not on YouTube. And I totally understand that from the perspective of people who are content creators and they have to make their money, and whether it's Daily Wire or Symbolic World. And I'm not looking to get a BA or anything like that, but boy, these are really interesting topics. So let's dive in. And I don't have a whole lot of time to spend on this right now. And there's so many things I want to spend time on that I never necessarily get back to. So let's go.
Probably everything that you imagine purgatory is wrong according to the 12th century, which
Mm-hmm.
is what I'm going to be talking about now. So, if I describe things to you from the popular medieval experience of purgatory in the 12th century, and you're like, no, that's not right at all. I know. I'm not coming at anybody. What I'm really interested in is the world of the Middle Ages. And in fact, I'm going to be sort of defending why this was like a reasonable thing for them to believe.
Mhm.
Even though it's not something that I personally believe, it's not something my church teaches.
These realities are realities that we deal with now. I don't believe in the idea that
Okay, before we get to Jonathan's point here, Richard's point I think was excellent, and it's true. If you listen to their whole video, he deals with purgatory primarily from a historical perspective. How did medieval teachings of purgatory make sense in their world? And it's a terrific video, and I found it super helpful. Now, what Jonathan's about to say, I think, is again a point that I've made a number of times, and it's a huge piece of, I think, why the work of Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot has been so fruitful in terms of once again giving the Bible and church dogmas of various kinds credibility, because the main move that Peugeot makes is that many people sort of implicitly read the Bible in a particular way, usually sort of thinking we're over here and then going back in history and then having all kinds of questions about, well, was the furniture there or there? Did they have a chair or a table? Or all of this sort of emissarian type questions. Whereas Peugeot sort of looks at the Bible and says, the Bible describes reality the way it is. And if you want to understand reality, read the Bible in such a way that you can see what the Bible claims about reality. Now, when I looked at Trent Horn's video a little bit, sort of complaining about Peterson, I think he's changed the title a little bit. And he had all of sort of try to pull those punches against Peterson. But again, a big part of the difference between them is that so much of the way we approach the Bible, and actually today we had, I know some of you will just skip over the video of the conversation that we had today with the participants of the Estuary Conference in Olympia, Washington next month. It was an outstanding conversation, and Chris Green is just really a rock star. And he so fits, Nate Heil is right, he so fits in with so many of our conversations here. But what Peugeot is about to say, if you can understand this about Peugeot, you can understand so much of what he does. If you can't understand this about Peugeot, almost everything he does is inscrutable.
reasonable thing for them to believe,
Mhm.
even though it's not something that I.
I don't believe in the idea that when we talk about the afterlife, that we're only talking about what happens to you after you die. The reality of sin, okay,
Now, he said the word quickly, but it was really important. He said, when we talk about the reality of the afterlife, I don't believe we're only, and I think if he were in a chair like mine, where, I mean, he gets criticized by this plenty, but you have to hear that word only because that is true of Jonathan too. And he has to continue to make these disclaimers. And of course, I've seen this the whole time I've watched him on YouTube. But the point he's making is that the Bible describes reality. And he's not thinking primarily in terms of, let's say, the way creation science was thinking about the way the Bible describes reality.
is that it makes after you die. When we talk about the afterlife, that we're only talking about what happens to you after you die. The reality of sin, okay, is that it makes you suffer. When that happens, you have two choices in dealing with the suffering that sin causes in your life. And one is torment, and the other is purgation. Those are the two possibilities you have. That is actually the reason, you could say, why sin causes suffering. The suffering is an opportunity for repentance every time. Jonathan, another universal history, and Richard has a great surprise, one that I did not expect. So I will let him introduce the subject today.
Yeah, okay, so we're gonna try something a little tricky today, which is gonna be taking you all the way from the edge of the world, which is, of course, Ireland, which is kind of where we are in Universal history right now, all the way to the Mountain of Purgatory in Dante's Divine Comedy, and the unlikely connection between those two things. So, what I'm going to try to do is to outline some things that are kind of, and I know, by the way, that in our last episode, I said here's what we're going to do the next two videos, and then we're not doing either of those things today, but we will get to them. But what I wanted to do today was actually to outline some things that are kind of unique and interesting about Irish Christianity. One of which is the sort of the genesis of the popular medieval idea of purgatory. I
Which
say the
I did
pop,
not know. This is like the
yeah,
massive surprise, and it comes right at the right time because, as all of you might know or might not know, on August 27th, we are going to start to ascend the mountain of Purgatory, Richard and I,
that's right.
and continue on the second Dante class. So you can please go and
And I'll give you a little spoiler. So I, in college, took a class on the Divine Comedy. And unfortunately, I was too young to really appreciate it. And I was too ignorant to understand the context. But Richard really does a nice job with this. And just the fact that many medieval descriptions of purgatory sort of had the purgation outsourced to demons, and purgatory is, just listen to the whole video, you'll hear it. Whereas, let's say if you think about Lewis's The Great Divorce, which is really in many ways about a purgatory story, you can listen to Tolkien Leaf by Niggle as well, which is a purgatory story. There's no demons in Lewis's and Where the Bus Goes, and sort of the foothills of heaven, let's say. And so just that little spoiler, just that little element, when I heard it, was just like, wow. And just like Peugeot said, I knew like nothing of any of this stuff. So super cool.
sign up. The first class was just an absolute blast, and everybody really enjoyed it. So we're hoping that everybody will continue on the trek with us.
And yes, so as Jonathan said, we're starting August the 27th. You can get the course now at Symbolic World Courses. There are payment plans and everything there to make it convenient for you. It's going to be incredible. Purgatorio is actually my favorite book of the whole comedy to teach. It's the one that most people, when you're in school, you read Inferno and that's all you read. If you read Dante at all in like high school or college, you probably only read Inferno.
Mm.
Purgatory is my favorite one to teach. It's the one that is kind of, you could say, in a certain sense, the most relevant to where many of us are in our Christian life. That is to say, Purgatory is about the purification, right? It's about the process of becoming saints.
Mm.
And so,
Now, again, to touch on the teaser about what Peugeot would say, even having listened to that teaser, even having listened to this whole video, even having done all of this stuff, I find it so hard to stop thinking like a modern man with respect to locating this story in my assumptions. And I know exactly what Richard's going to say because I've listened to it already, and this video blew me away. I super enjoyed this video. But what's amazing is that our formation, the way we are formed, subtly by all of our experiences, even if we learn something sort of insightful and revolutionary and then can change us, just because I learned that doesn't mean it sinks in and changes.
whereas, Inferno is like about sort of rejecting sin, and then Paradise is about what even is holiness. And Paradise is the hardest one to teach. We are going to be doing it later this year. Paradise is the hardest one to teach, though, because it's very hard to explain to somebody exactly what it means to be holy. But I think all of us can understand what it's like to try to become holy. So anyway, join us for Purgatorio. It's going to be really awesome, and you're going to get a little bit of a foretaste of that today, but you're going to get it via
Through Ireland.
Ireland. Yeah. All right. So, in no particular order, I've been really immersing myself the last few weeks in a ton of reading about Irish Christianity and specifically Irish 6th century monasticism. So this is monasticism in Ireland in the 500s. Why specifically that? A couple of reasons. So first of all, the thing that you could say about Irish Christianity right off the bat, and the it's fair to call the Church of like the northern, like the Church of the British Isles and even sort of the northern France, um, during the 6th and 7th centuries, it would be not an exaggeration to call it an Irish church.
Hmm.
Even in like northern France or northern Gaul, as it was called at the time, a lot of the main churches, a lot of the main Christian settlements there are being established by Irish missionaries. Christianity in Britain, it's not really
Now, just to add a little flavor back here, 6th and 7th century, rough times in the Western Roman Empire. Everything is falling apart. I was, when I was in Italy, I was doing some reading about the history of Italy, and everything is just kind of coming apart in many ways, and the East is much more secure and wealthy, but the West is falling apart. And what's so interesting is that in some ways, Ireland sort of acts like a cultural appendix. But it's also important to remember that this culture, way out on the edge of the world, is a different culture. And one of the most amazing things about Christianity is how Christianity somehow manages to infiltrate and be owned by people of other cultures. And it seems the narrative thread isn't lost. That today we see Africans and Asians becoming Christians. And certainly they take things and borrow things from places that have long established Christian cultures and history. But somehow, and there's always problems that develop as well, but somehow Christianity is able to make these cultural leaps in ways that most other religions struggle with.
England at this time quite yet, but Christianity in Britain is also mainly founded and kind of directed by these Irish spiritual centers.
Yeah, and it's
Same
important.
thing in what is now called Wales.
And people have to remember that the relationship between the Gauls and the Irish, there is a filiation like that
Right.
would have been recognized by. It's not the same. The French, as we understand them today, they're not the same peoples as the Gauls and the
That's right.
Gallic people. All these people that are
Yeah.
related to Ireland.
The Gauls are Celts, as are the Welsh and the Irish, right? And so Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is a kind of a similar culture there, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that were preserved in Ireland. This is actually the origin of a very compelling thesis that was really popular. I want to say in like maybe the 1970s, maybe that's the wrong decade, but there was this book that came out called How the Irish Saved Civilization. And the thesis of the book is not terrible. It's also very reductive. Like almost any convincing thesis is extremely reductive. Like because history itself is very complicated.
Now, How the Irish Saved Civilization was written by Thomas Cahill. Thomas Cahill was a very popular author. I had members of my church. Thomas Cahill, this book was the Audible release date. No, I don't want the Audible release date. I want the release date of the book. 1995, the book came out. But members of my church were reading Thomas Cahill. Cahill's pretty popular. So
But in the Irish, how the Irish saved civilization, they basically kind of posit that while the Dark Ages was going on in Western Europe, if you want to say that there is a period, obviously everybody who knows me knows I hate the term the Dark Ages and almost never use it. But you could say there is a period when like the Huns are invading
Yeah.
and stuff is getting burned and stuff is getting destroyed and stuff. And but Ireland was kind of far enough removed from the action that they were able to preserve learning and literacy, the Christian faith, and all these other really important things. Um, okay, so
Yeah, hence why Charlemagne
yeah,
gets
right.
Irish monks to basically help him re-Christianize
Yeah.
the Europe. So,
Yeah, and again, because history is always a little more complicated than that, Charlemagne brings people in not just from Ireland, but he brings people in from the British Isles generally. So,
okay.
for instance, Charlemagne's main court theologian and basically his minister of education was a an Anglo-Saxon deacon named Alcuin, who is my bitter enemy. Of course, he doesn't know this because he's been dead for a long time. But Alcuin didn't like icons, actually. There's a whole thing about this, but he also didn't like Beowulf. So, it's just like
Didn't
all
like
my
Beowulf.
favorite.
There you go.
No, no. Well, we don't know if he liked Beowulf specifically, but he really hated stories like Beowulf. Like he hated that these monks were like writing down and telling like old Germanic hero stories. And he also really rejected the idea of representational iconography. So he was okay with like you could depict the ark in church, but you couldn't like depict Christ,
Hmm.
right? And so anyway, this is neither here nor there, but yes, Charlemagne basically went to the British Isles, looking for help in trying to sort of reestablish his educational project on the continent. So anyway, all of this to say, Christianity in Ireland and in Northern Gaul and in Britain, um, uh, in the sixth and the seventh centuries was first and foremost monastic. So the main unit in Irish culture, in Celtic culture in general, is like the tuat, um, which means basically.
now, this I found fascinating, and even part of the reason I do these videos is, well, I've listened to this video before, and I often find that if it's a good video, one listening through isn't sufficient. And I really sort of want to slow down on certain things. When he talks about the fact that it is monastic. Well, what does that Christianity is monastic? Well, what does that mean? And again, I'm thoroughly Protestant, and so I made the videos that I made this week were about basically the mission of the Christian Reformed Church, and I didn't do so much on my videos, but on CRC Voices, I talked about the fact that there's been a sort of a tribe or a theme or a stream in the Christian Reformed Church that has been transformationalist Kuyperian. When I went to, I start talking about the Christian Reformed Church in this video about Purgatory, but when I went to Calvin College, they had CPOL, which everyone was supposed to take. I didn't take it, but I took Dante's Divine Comedy instead of CPOL actually, and which was Christian Perspectives on Learning. Freshmen were supposed to take it, and it was supposed to, Calvin was there to deliver this world and life view. And this world and life view, in many ways, was built on a transformationalist perspective. There was a book out, Christ and Culture, which is a very popular book, and they had all of these different positions with respect to Christ. I should look for that book. I'm sure there's tons of them out there in the used book market. You probably even find it on Kindle. It's easy to get the Niebuhrs mixed up. There's Reinhold Niebuhr and H. Richard Niebuhr. Reinhold was more popular, and he's the one that wrote the that penned the Serenity Prayer the AA uses. H. Richard was a scholar, his brother, and also has a very interesting book on denominationalism that I have back there. Reinhold, the book was published in 1951 as a seminal work on Christian ethics and theology, where Niebuhr explored the relationship between Christianity and society. Niebuhr identified 5 paradigms of how Christians have historically related to culture. Christ against culture. This view emphasizes a clear separation between Christian community and the secular world. Secular world. Tom Holland would flag that right there. Advocates believe that the value of the secular world are fundamentally opposed to Christian values, leading to a rejection of worldly culture. Christ of culture, in this perspective, there's a harmonization between Christ and culture. Proponents see no fundamental conflict between the teaching of Christ and the achievements of culture, often emphasizing cultural achievements as a way to express Christian faith. Now, of course, this was written in 1951, and so in a lot of ways he's sort of dealing with the things that are mostly on the table at that point. Christ above culture. This model seeks a synthesis where Christ is seen as fulfilling and completing the highest aspirations of culture. Culture is acknowledged but seen as incomplete without divine revelation brought by Christ. Nature, grace. Some Roman Catholic systems sort of have kind of a 2-tier thing. Christ and culture in paradox. This approach recognizes an ongoing tension between Christ and culture. Christians live in both the world of grace and the world of sin, navigating the paradox of being in the world but not of it. Christ transforming culture. This paradigm suggests that Christ works through culture to bring about its transformation. The goal is not to reject culture, but to reform and redeem in accordance with Christian values. And this, for a particular stream and group in the Christian Reformed Church, really became the mission of the Christian Reformed Church. I talked about this in the videos, and then Calvin College was sort of the launching pad from which young Christian Reformed people would go out into the world to transform culture for Christ. And I talked about some other streams on CRC Voices. I didn't do this on the video, where there's sort of the confessionalists, who were kind of the conservatives. Before the Second World War, the purpose of the church was to sort of, you had the church and you had Christian day schools, and the purpose was to maintain the Dutch Calvinism that people had brought over from Europe to this new land, and keep it here and keep ourselves unspoiled from the Methodism that was pervasive in America, and certainly resist the Catholics. And that was sort of the mission of the Christian Reformed Church before the Second World War. But in the process of assimilation after the Second World War, there were other streams that sort of came into the church. Pentecostalism, third wave. You can find study committees in Christian Reformed synods, charismatic movement, Pentecostalism, so the Dunamis tribe. And one of the newest strains has been what I call the neo-sacramentalist movement, where when we started planting churches in Sacramento, we used a variety of methods. The first, most successful church plant by Kevin Adams, he's been on the channel, was Granite Springs. They very much used a seeker methodology to get launched. We had cell churches and some of these things. So you sort of have the evangelical wing of the Christian Reformed Church that was into individual conversion and salvation of the soul, this kind of thing. And then over the last 20 years, almost all of our church plants that have survived have weekly communion, more intentional liturgy, a lot of language that some might look at and say, now, are you Christian Reformed or are you Anglican? Because there's been a lot of neo-sacramentalism, weekly communion, all of that. My church is the only one that doesn't have weekly communion, partly just because it's my people. We've been doing monthly communion for a very long time, and my people are sort of that way. So anyway, what has sort of gone away from the Christian Reformed Church is this mission through the transformationalists. And when you hear a term like the church is very monastic, that doesn't mean they don't have missions, because of course he just finished saying that these Irish monks became missionaries. So my friend Kevin Adams, I've told this story before, he starts very much with sort of a seeker methodology, and bit by bit by bit they've sort of transformed into something that's a little bit more neo-sacramental. They have weekly communion. He had a little pastors group out where he lives, and one of the pastors in his pastors group was an Orthodox priest, and he learned a lot from the Orthodox priest. He really appreciated it. I think he might have an icon or two in his office even. But I've told the story before. The other two guys were church planters. Another one was Reformed, and I forget what denomination the third one was from. The one was PCA, and then the other guy was, again, probably more in the Baptist spectrum. I don't recall, maybe Methodist. But he was talking to the Orthodox priest, and he was talking about evangelism, and he said, well, we're not ready to do evangelism yet. And Kevin was like, what? Well, we don't have our cathedral or our monastery. And so just because the church is monastic doesn't mean that the church doesn't do evangelism, or the church, but yeah, you have a question in terms of the mode through which and the goals that the church have for the civilization. And now that's much more a part of our conversation now. Goals for the civilization, whereas before that was sort of implicit. But the transformationalist, we didn't really think about all of these post-liberal issues like we're thinking about them now. And so if you look at the church over time, the church has had many different strategies and goals. And you can, of course, state these goals sort of theologically and very abstract, but if you sort of bring them down, you might ask, okay, well, what exactly is your goal and how are you going to arrive there? Oops.
Main unit in Irish culture, in Celtic culture in general, is like the tuat, which means basically like the clan or the tribe.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the sort of main unit, and then you have somebody called the Rí, who is the head of the tuat. He's the chieftain. He's the warlord. He's the king. And this is basically how Irish civilization kind of arranged itself. And then you had these. We'll talk about this in a couple of videos when we look at
So say looking at it through Christ and culture, Christianity goes there and it has to figure out how to impact the culture. And because cultures are arranged in different ways, and if this particular culture is very tribal and these families have particular cultural ways, then the church is going to have to figure out, well, how exactly do we engage in this, and what will the transformation look like?
colloquy civilization kind of arranged itself. And then you had these. We'll talk about this in a couple of videos when we look at the colloquy of the elders of Ireland, or as our friend Dr. Martin Shaw calls it, old men talking, in which you have kind of these remnants of war bands. So you have like the Tuat, and which are like this is the band, this is the tribe or the clan with a defined social structure and a leader. But then you also had these roving bands of basically single young men running across the countryside and causing trouble. And the main job of basically all civilization, in case people out there don't know what is civilization for, the main job of civilization is to figure out how to properly harness your single young males.
Mic drop. I thought, wow, when he said that, and I was probably, working in the backyard or doing the dishes or folding the laundry. I mean, I listen to a lot of this stuff when I'm just doing stuff with my hands or exercising or something like that. And he said that, I thought, bang. Yeah, he's right. He is right. Now, of course, that is a particular view of culture, but when I listen to all of the anxiety in our culture right now, and when you understand why Jordan Peterson sort of emerged as such a force, we are, and when you look at, let's say, a lot of the agenda of how many cultural agendas over the last 75 years with respect to young men, you can say, yeah, he's right. That's worth hearing him say it again.
That's the job of basically all civilization. In case people out there don't know what is civilization for, the main job of civilization is how to is to figure out how to properly harness your single young males. That's the main problem that every civilization has ever had to solve. I'm really serious about this. Yeah.
Yeah. It makes sense.
But that's the main problem every civilization has had to solve. So the way that they would try to solve these like roving war bands, which are basically, in some other age bandits, right? But they were like sort of like bands of heroes, you could say, in their own minds. Or, I mean, is somebody a bandit or are they a hero? This is really a matter of perspective.
Right, exactly.
Now I should mention that I just did my riff draft for Sunday, which is on sacraments, which, of course, for not so much for Living Stones, but for the YouTube channel, it's like, okay, we're going to talk about sacraments, and we have Orthodox, Catholics, streams of Protestants, atheists, and spiritual but not religious, and we have to talk about sacraments, so that's going to be an interesting thing. But then I knew I wanted to do a video, but oh, Chad's streaming, and I saw his title. It was like Friday Night Fire, and I thought, oh, they're going to do something outside with the campfire, and then I get there and they're doing this. But Chad was talking about celebrities and Chris Howard. Chris Howard signed up for a Randos conversation right when Freddie's mom died, and so I'm hoping to get out of the weeds, and then I owe Chris a Randos, and I hope something. And Mark S, of course, being a friend of Chad. So anyway, so if you're wondering about celebrity, and when Richard talks about local heroes, well, that's right. And who are the heroes, and how are they looked up to, and what are the structures and platforms, and yeah. So you can check out Friday's Chad's live stream.
In the ancient world. And so they would, very often what you do is you try to hire these people, you give them some land, and they settle down, and you give them wives, and they marry, and they become integrated into your tuat. They become integrated into your tribe or into your clan. So, anyway, all this to say, when Christianity comes to the
And so I'm way behind in the rest of this history, and I'm listening to the roots of the First World War, and they're talking about why Austria-Hungary was so slow in attacking Serbia, which became actually a huge problem and a cause of the war. But they're so slow because all of their soldiers are out in the field harvesting. And if you listen to what Richard Rowland was basically saying, is that these tuats basically want to grow themselves. And now especially that we have all this attention not on population expansion, but on population collapse. Increasingly, if the internet chatter is correct, young men are going to be very valuable. And, I think for a while, the idea has been young men are very problematic, but young men are going to be very valuable. And that's been the case for many, many years. And so the ability to attract people and to integrate them. And so what's so interesting now is that there's all of this in the West tension around immigration because people are basically feeling the pressure of losing a civilizational consensus. But again, if this population collapse thing is correct, a lot of the questions coming in the future, and again, we might see a rise of monasticism again, because all of this integration involves you need to know who you are, and you need to be stable, and you need to be attractive, and you need to be able to transform the stranger who comes into your tribe and make them a part of your tribe. And I think when we think about the world, the United States has been quite good at that, as opposed to many European nations, and Japan doesn't even try. So this little, there's so many interesting ideas in this video. It's just full of them, and interesting ideas that aren't even necessarily connected with Purgatory, but just with sort of filling out the ancient or the medieval world and saying these are the dynamics and these are the structures.
British Isles. under a variety of unnamed missionaries, and ultimately through via the Salmon of Heaven, Saint Patrick, who was not himself Irish. He was British, but he came to Ireland as a missionary after having escaped Ireland as a slave. He came back to Ireland as a missionary and sort of converts the island. And there's all kinds of stories about this. We'll probably read some of them. I mean, part of the struggle, as I said last time in talking about Ireland, is the sheer breadth of the content. I have this wonderful collection just of Irish saints' lives, which are so mind-boggling. I mean, there's some of these saints' lives, Jonathan, that we could do 7 or 8 videos just on the crazy, sometimes really messed up symbolism in one of these. Like there's
And I think part of the reason why so much of Peugeot and Roland's and Martin Shaw's and Paul Kingsnorth, so much of this work is so well received and so hungry for it is that there is so much interesting material out there in Lives of the Saints and in mythology, and for all sorts of politically correct reasons, and because of, let's say, secularization, and partly because of Protestantism looking at it and say, well, we don't believe these things. This stuff has just been ignored, and we're having this current poverty of imagination in the cultural storytellers of Hollywood that they're leaving a place wide open for the symbolic world to say, you want good stories? Psh, there's a ton of good stories out there.
there's some of these that are like, I don't know if I can even talk about this on the internet. Like, I just don't know if I can even like talk about this in public. But they're really beautiful, and but also very strange and wonderful. And so, we'll come back to that in a moment. But the thing I'm trying to say is that basically what happened was, as Christianity was established in Ireland, that the monastery took the place of the Tuat, and the abbot took the place of the Ri. And so what you had was kind of in Irish Christianity is kind of this unique situation, um, that does show up other places in Christianity as well, but not to the same degree or in the same intensity, where almost every bishop is the abbot of a monastery.
And this is so interesting and it doesn't mean that they didn't have churches, but the church and the monastery function in different ways. Now, of course, if you think about the culture of first century Judea and Galilee, and then you think about the culture of the Greek-speaking portion of the Roman Empire, you've got two pretty distinct cultures there, and now you've got another culture. And basically what you can see is that Christianity sort of continues to be able to have a flexibility to rework itself and remold and adapt, and maybe take an institution, take monasticism and do something with it for this culture that works to evangelize the culture. Now, of course, again, Protestantism comes along and very much does the same thing. And part of what you see in the history of Christianity is that Christianity just keeps morphing and adapting and creating new, and off it keeps going all over the world in all of these different cultures, yet somehow sort of holding it together, often through the church, through the Bible, through the network.
Mm-hmm.
And bishops are based not out of cathedrals and cities, but they're based out of monastic communities. And then the rest of Irish life kind of orients itself around the monastic community, as opposed to, the situation that you have in most of the Christian world, where you have a city and a bishop of the city. And then
Right, because if you, let's say, look at Italy, as the Western Roman Empire is collapsing, the bishops of these cities begin to, take on a lot of importance in terms of helping the city survive the collapse of this former imperial system. As I mentioned before, I'm reading through John O'Malley's A History of the Popes, and part, with sort of the collapse of the empire and the collapse of the imperial system, you have other systems that are coming up, and you have different emperors that are coming up. Now, of course, Henry IV, and that whole business around the year 1000 that Tom Holland has written quite a bit about, and Hildebrand, and the castle at Canossa. But you see this real struggle, now after this period, because bishops have had a fair amount of authority and power, and of course this holds true of the Pope all the way up into the modern period. But there's all of this. Well, who should name bishops? Well, emperors name bishops. No, emperor shouldn't name bishops. And ecclesiastical offices should be for sale. And how many ecclesiastical offices can someone hold? And I mean, these issues are going to go all the way to the Reformation. And so, whereas on one hand, you've got this way in which the church just sort of is able to come into and if I say supplant, like Americans get all this nervous feeling about, it's the church that's doing blah, 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 blah. Now, you don't understand that things have sort of collapsed, and the church simply provided a better way for a particular culture to function with all of these values that it's bringing in. But then eventually you're going to have these kinds of struggles, and you see this then in Italy, and in Germany. Now in France it's going to be a little bit different because, of course, the monarchy is so powerful that the relationship between even these categories are fraught. Let's say this civil government, the secular government, and the church structures. I mean, this is so much history after Constantine and up to the Reformation. And one of the things that the Protestant Reformation does is really forces the Catholic Church to clean all this up. Because in order to compete and to not have Protestantism grow, they've got to have strong reforms where ecclesiastical offices are not sold anymore, and you can't hold 4 or 5 ecclesiastical offices because you're getting the money for it, and you can't, and the priests and the bishops and the popes can't have concubines and children. I mean, all of this. But this is part of the reason that stuff grows is because, of course, all of these categories, which for us are just so built into our worldview, and if the, let's say, so Living Stones decides, we're going to merge with Christ Church Davis or something like that, and the mayor of Sacramento comes and puts a new minister here at Living Stones. Everyone in the country would be like, what? The mayor of Sacramento can't install a minister in Living Stones? That's just crazy. Well, it's crazy because of the Protestant Reformation. And it isn't to say that it wasn't resisted. In fact, if you read the history, there's all sorts of tensions, and they have these reforms, and some of the big reforms are to push out the emperors and the kings and the other civil magistrates from basically running the church. But this is a battle that will be fought for centuries. But the roots of it, of course, are that these monks and these church leaders are competent, and they're capable, and they're honest, and they are religiously often motivated for the welfare of the city. And you can even see this in some ways in Calvin's Geneva. Because of course Calvin was, why was Calvin in Geneva the way he was with respect to that Swiss city? And of course you had all these French refugees coming in. So, and even in some places in the United States, we would often hold neighborhood association meetings at the church. And when a city council person needed to interface with a particular little community, they would come to me and say, can we use your facility? And then I would introduce them. And so you see, and of course in a place like Ireland, and places where it's not a Protestant place. And then you look at, again, the history of Pope Pius XI and Mussolini. Just a fascinating history. So this point about how these things sort of grow together, it's super important. And partially because of the early successes, that's going to complicate the much longer history. Maybe I'll go a little while and I really have to land the plane and stop this because I have to get home and have dinner with my wife and spend an evening together.
There are monastic communities that support the Christians in the city, but the bishop has his like own cathedral, right? So it's a different kind of a situation. It's actually honestly, it's one of those things like being Orthodox in America today. It's not totally dissimilar from this, in the sense that you still got bishops and cathedrals and things like this, but being Orthodox is like it's so weird. Like it's so you're so sort of like kind of separate from the rest of the world around you in a certain way that everybody's kind of oriented around that community, and it's not unusual at all for us to have like our bishops living in monasteries here, even
Yeah.
here in the United States. But at the
My
time,
bishop lived in a monastery.
yeah, there you go. At the time, this was pretty kind of exceptional. So
All right, I'm going to pause it here. And I'm only 13 minutes in, and it is over an hour video, and it is excellent. So if you haven't listened to it, you should definitely listen to it. I really hope I can come back to it because when he starts talking about word and, I mean, there's just so much really foundational stuff that is very applicable to so many of the other conversations that we're having. And then getting into Purgatory, and again to bring in Peugeot's perspective, sort of, okay, we're not going to just think diachronically about here and there. We're going to, I was just looking at Anselman's comment because I knew when Chris Green at 111 said what he said about the resurrection, I thought, yeah, I've sort of like a pastor in a church. I know who in the comment corner is not going to like the way he phrased that. Now, whether that's a fair representation of everything he believes, I can't tell you because I don't know the man that much. But this was I think the question of purgatory is really a nice way into so many of the bigger issues that we're just sort of processing in this corner. So unfortunately, if I had 5 hours, I could probably sit in this chair and do a full commentary on the full video, and it would be awesome. But I can't. So leave a comment.